Hey, deserving listeners, we have a special guest with us today. It's Zain, my colleague and friend from Antioch, a fellow professor. I have been scaling back my hours at the university over the last year or two, and although I'm a lot less stressed out and I don't have to commute anymore and I don't have to go to boring meetings anymore, but I do miss hanging out with colleagues and professors and students, incidentally, because I don't know, there's just a lot of energy, a lot of exchange of ideas, bonding that happens when you're a part of a team. And now I'm not so much experiencing that anymore. So I thought I would invite some of my professors onto the podcast, and I'd get two birds with one stone. We get an episode out of it because there's a lot of expertise among the professors. And two, I got to check in and hang out with my old friends. What was it like moving to Seattle?
It was interesting. I think at first I was enamored because it's a hilly place and there's a lot going on. I was enamored, but I was also in some ways still fishing for community. It's a tough thing out here. I think anytime you move to a new city, it's difficult.
Particularly during the pandemic.
Yeah, 2 years in was the pandemic.
Yeah.
But also the cultural stratification of Seattle. Had I known a little bit more about the city, I would have been like, let me hang out in South Seattle a little bit more. When I first came in, people were just like, oh, like live in Ballard. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds right. And it wasn't right for me. But I had a good time here while I've been here. So
a lot of white people in North Seattle.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's more dogs than South Asians.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the neighborhood I live in. Sometimes I marvel at, even though I'm half white, I'm the most exotic person within a square mile or something. And South Seattle, definitely more people of color. So you're leaving soon. You're just leaving in a couple of weeks.
14 days, yep.
Yeah. How do you feel about it?
I feel great about it.
Where are you going? Back to Michigan?
Michigan, yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a job out there or anything?
No. So last year, I was in the Midwest. So a little bit about myself. I was married before. And so part of my journey to Seattle was an adventure. I was newly married and we wanted to go on an adventure. We used my new degree as an opportunity to go and try and dabble into a new city. Sweetheart of a person, didn't work out. And so now it's like reset. So last year, sort of the last leg of that relationship, I was texting the chairs, Jen and Kayla. I was like, yeah, this feels really good to be in the Midwest. I was in Chicago at the time visiting. I think I have the greatest range of classes. Like I teach like a lot of different classes at Antioch, or it's close, right? And we had one instructor who was online, is not teaching at Antioch anymore. And when that happened, I think Jen and Kayla had recalled that I really wanted to be in the Midwest, and they let me be online.
Oh, so you're going to stay with Antioch?
I'm going to stay with Antioch, yeah.
Interesting.
But secret, being in a different spot will also open up a different world of opportunities and things that I might want to do with my career. So right,
it would be natural to consider other job opportunities in your neck of the woods once you're out there. But at the very least, it's nice to have a transition employment.
It's a huge blessing. Like I don't know many people that get an opportunity to keep their job and kind of live in whatever city.
Yeah. But it makes sense. I mean, Antioch, the program is now half 70, at least, well, but it's more, isn't it? More than half online?
Yeah, I suppose so. But I think like the tracks, like there's certain tracks that are set up online, certain tracks that are, like FOO, for example, which you taught for many years. Like we have half of our sections online, half the sections are in person. So, we need the in-person, right? But
yeah, I am a little concerned that you could have a student that would have the majority of their classes online.
Yeah.
Having said that, it's like there's a lot of people I know who are solely online. The pandemic required that, and then they just stuck with it. They don't do any in-person services, and seem to be doing good work. So maybe I'm just an old fuddy-duddy or something, but I don't know. I feel like there's a connection that only I can feel when I'm in person.
I feel that way too. I actually think that's the thing I'm dreading the most. As I love teaching in person.
Yeah.
There's something that you can do just with students and the camaraderie. And we talk so much about the therapeutic alliance, and it's one of my ways that I can say, fuck theory, be a human.
Yeah.
And how do you practice that really?
Yeah.
There's a limitation at least online, and I'm going to miss that, but I'm ready to move though.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, pros and cons, but because I haven't taught in person since before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because I'm currently not teaching right now. I will in the future, and I plan on teaching in person when I do. But when it was online, the discussions, the bonding, the energy was like 10% that of what it is in person.
Yeah.
Although I got through the class and I got paid and the students seemed satisfied similarly to other times, I personally was diminishing. I don't know what word to put to it. I just wilting as a professor or something. I just felt like I wasn't getting what I wanted out of it. That's one of the things that maybe students don't necessarily think about, but we don't get into this for the money or the fame or anything. Professors, we primarily do it because it's gratifying professionally. It feels good, it feels meaningful, feels human, feels important. And online, most of that feeling for me was gone. I'm guessing that it still had meaning and it still had worth, of course, but over time, it just slowly chipped away at my motivation, I guess. But anyway, so I don't know if I can cut all this out if you don't want me to include this, but I think a lot of people out there, because there's a lot of lay people who listen to this podcast, and they might wonder, as a family therapist for yourself, going through a divorce, what's that like? So I could cut all this out, but...
Oh, no, I'm happy to talk about it. Okay. Sometimes there's dissonance. It's like, well, there's so many things that you've seen your clients achieve. How come you couldn't have figured that stuff out in your own life? You kind of have that. It's kind of low hanging, like criticism of oneself. But actually, it's made me a much better therapist.
How so?
Well, like I said, I have a really good relationship with my ex, and we don't talk every day or something like that. But we have a good relationship in the sense of respect, right? There's no lingering animosity. It's not like I'm like, she was the villain, I was the villain. I think most people, outside of cases of abuse, we really need to be thinking in a self-reflective way about like, what did I contribute? Also, what things were out of my hands.
Do you think being a marriage therapist helped you to achieve that perspective?
It didn't hurt. It didn't hurt, and it didn't hurt having emotionally in tune colleagues and friends who have gone through life transitions. But what's more important for me was, maybe it was because of as a family therapist that I knew to do this. I sought emotionally intelligent people out. Part of that's like pandemic and loneliness, like it was all happening at the same time. But I was picky. Like I wasn't, I think sometimes when we're lonely, we want to just like, who's here? What's the quick fix? What's the quick warmth? And like, don't get me wrong, like I did my Netflix binges and I did my like, man, I should have slept 5 hours ago, like stuff. But it was a big deal to kind of just seek out emotionally in tune friendships, people that were just validating, like, I would be anxious too,
And people that wouldn't necessarily jump on a hateful bandwagon, a villainizing bandwagon about your former partner.
No, that wouldn't help me process anything.
So you were conscious about that. Like, okay, that person, maybe I shouldn't vent to because they could contribute to a negative cycle for me.
There's moments of consciousness, but it's also kind of like, when you're thirsty for water and you need some water and something's going to make you feel hydrated. Other shit's not. Like, and so I had certain friendships that I leaned into. It's really like, I would say like being a dude in your 30s, like I hear all the time that we're isolated people and we don't have deep friendships.
On average, because of socialization and toxic masculinity, but
100%.
Certainly we don't have to ascribe to those notions.
Yeah, I think I burned some of that down at a young age just because I had losses and transitions at a young age. And I needed support. Often as a therapist, like spending time giving other people support, turning that inwards was not easy and I still struggle with it. But when I am doing it, it does feel really good to just get reciprocal care, especially from my male friendships, like because I don't expect it out here. And so when I find a friend that I can just like, again, talk to, but like you said, they're not going to just like shit on my ex. Like that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Do your clients know?
Sometimes. Yeah. Like it depends. Like, I will sometimes do artful self-disclosure. if it's appropriate.
Yeah.
You know, I might share with them, and I'm not going to get into the details. I mean, I have my therapist.
Yeah.
Right, for that, and this podcast apparently. But but I have, and it's important to normalize it. Like, you know, people talk about still, right, even with the high rate, people talk about divorce as synonymous with a failure.
Yeah.
Your relationship failed.
Yeah. Particularly if you're a marital therapist, like it's to people who maybe are ignorant to reality about what life is or what divorce is or what marital therapists are, it would be a badge of disgrace that somehow who would take your advice if you got divorced yourself, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of look at it as I went to the university of figuring out what my needs are. I was with somebody for an appointed time, and sometimes you have companions for a certain journey, and it doesn't go on forever. I have that perspective. I also got lucky in the sense that, like I said, I have a lot of respect and maintenance of like just goodwill we have towards each other, which helped me. I can't imagine what it would be like to be in this profession and just kind of be like really just feel like constant villainizing back and forth between two people.
Yeah.
So I got lucky in that sense, but no, I think it's made my therapeutic experiences more rich in the sense that I almost have this like really healthy irreverence for, oh no, that transition happened in your life, like you're screwed, you know? And I already knew that consciously and from previous life experiences, but when you're going through your own stuff and you're like, okay, I need to seek my care, I need to see my therapist, I need to see my friends, what your diet is when you take care of yourself during those transitions, it translates to being a better therapist, in my opinion.
Are you saying that you can empathize more with people who fall into a pit of despair when they're going through a transition and know that if one gets support, then it's less horrible?
Yeah, if I have to be present with myself to pick myself up through a transition, the switch to be present with clients is less, it's more seamless to just be present. I have to be present with all the things.
Right, because from the outside, one might see, even if we're a therapist, to be like, well, you know, what's the big deal? I get that it's scary to you, but from my perspective, it's a transition and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
But when you're going through it, it's devastating, and there's so much chaos and so much shame and uncertainty, and there's a lot of needs that are being challenged, and self-identity that's being challenged. You know, that identity of being a married guy and then you're a single guy, you know, and the giving up of a future that you probably had sort of solidified into your mind, and how your community had solidified a future for you, and now it's just completely different, you know. And so what are the wide variety of courses that you teach? I know some of the courses, but
oh man, I teach multicultural perspectives, individual therapy in the family system. I've taught assessment and treatment diagnostics, beginning skills CFT, advanced narrative therapy. I have taught systems perspectives, family of origin. There was a one-off person of the therapist 3. It was like the, elective course, but now that's been kind of fused into other classes.
Oh, it has?
Yeah, that's part of we kind of did a culture shift at Antioch.
Oh, well, what happened?
Dr. Anthony Pennant now just finished his doctorate, which is super dope. Him and I kind of became a tag team when we both got hired because we were both interested in the Harry Aponte person of the therapist model. Yeah. That stuff is, it's really awesome. And it's stuff that gets avoided when we're really, focused on what's the new, what's the flavor of the week, hashtag Gottman's, what's the flavor of the week, what's the nexus that we all have to go get trained in. I think it's really important to distinguish between one's goals for your career, how you want to serve people, and then what's popular. Because they're not going to always be the same. And 10 years ago was different. Well, and the foundations of helping through psychotherapy haven't really changed in 50 years. I mean, certainly there's certain awarenesses that have arisen that weren't present 50 years ago, but certain ideas about person of the therapist, countertransference, people and empathy and positive regard and systems thinking, these ideas have been around a long time. And so sometimes I would lament that professors get tired of teaching the things they've been teaching for 20 years and they want to teach something new.
and exciting and cutting edge. And so they go in those directions rather than teaching the students the basics, Explain to the audience what Harry Aponte and what you and Anthony were trying to help the trainees with regarding person of the therapist.
Yeah, so it builds on a tradition of humanizing the therapy session. So kind of like Satir, Minuchin, we're here in the moment right now kind of stuff. And Harry Aponte had done this in a sort of a clinical space. Then he brought it to Drexel later on. And the idea is that you spend good time introspecting about what your patterns are, your themes. We call them signature themes.
As a therapist.
As a clinical, as a student, or as a therapist,
Yeah.
And so those are, the countertransference language is like, here's this thing that's going to happen in therapy where the client projects on you and you're going to project back. Countertransference, like literally a transferring of energy back, a boomerang. Still pathologizes the client for bringing it up in the first place. Like we're boomeranging back. That can happen. It's something we got to watch for, but it makes students like, the entire time they were reflecting on themselves being like, oh shit, what am I going to screw up? And that's their only thought process. Yeah. Right. Whereas person to the therapist is like, what are all the things happening to you that also happen, by the way, in your relationships, in the workspace, when you're alone, that happen in FOO, your family of origin, that happen everywhere. Right. And how are those things going to show up in therapy? And if it's more comprehensive, then it includes countertransference, but it also includes things like stuff that the client never brought in, but I'm bringing in, like, I'm tired because I haven't slept well, right? What does it have to do with the themes about how I care about myself throughout the week? But it's also celebrations, things about me that I know are cool, that help in relationships, that help in the workspace, And so the idea is that, so Harry Ponte's model gives students a thorough opportunity to first reflect on that for a class, and then we do attunement exercises where, like, where do you feel it? Because when you're dysregulated in a therapy session as a therapist, you're not going to be like, oh, let me slow down. Who, like, is when they're dysregulated is on their highest, ability to meditate,
Yeah.
So we have to train about that. Students deserve to train about that. Mm-hmm. So in the second quarter, we give them opportunities to
be distressed
and start to practice noting, where do I feel it? How do I notice it? Does my gaze hold against the wall? Maybe that's how I noticed. Anthony has this great statement. It's like when you feel like you need to put your back against the chair to ground yourself, like something's happening because you're having a shift. And so there's a tell, basically. Yeah. And in POT, that's called accessing the self.
POT, person of the therapist.
Person of the therapist, yeah. Oh, yeah, I imagine you have other episodes about...
just to make sure people understand what you're talking about. Yeah, interesting. Just a caveat, because I'm often, because I talk about countertransference, the term, and we'll talk about, there's various different definitions that have been put forth over 100 and plus years, and one of them is the one that you provided, which is the classic, which is it's counter to transference, and should be snuffed out according to Freud and others. It's something you want to get rid of, as if it's possible. And it is, to some extent, pathologized. But there are other more expansive definitions that I think include what one might call person of the therapist, or just our own experiences, and to not pathologize them. Winnicott, even in 49, had a seminal paper talking about how he hated his client, hated one of his teenage boy clients, and published about that and said, there's nothing wrong with me. It's just, he's a very aggravating client, and I think we need to talk about that. Anyway, but yeah, certainly a lot of people, even when I propose that countertransference can be considered something that is not pathologizable and totally normal and always present. That's my shtick, is that you're never not having countertransference. You're never not having a feeling or some kind of human experience or a reaction, because even when I say that, the students will still pathologize. Even after I lecture and talk, I'll say, "What's your countertransference?" Like, "Oh, I'm not having any. Everything's fine. I'm totally natural. I'm totally neutral." And I'm just like, it's not possible to be totally quote unquote neutral. If you are neutral, that'd be something to say. You're having a neutral countertransference or something. But anyway, so with person of the therapist track, I think it's interesting to kind of lay it out, is that we had, without going too much in the history of our program, we had this class that every student took in the first quarter called Family of Origin. And I've talked about that in the podcast before, where it's first quarter students and it involves learning about theory, learning about systems theory, particularly family of origin types, historical, developmental systems, ideas, Bowen, object relations, this kind of thing. Framo, and also applying it to the student's own childhood and their parents' childhood, and learning about how systems will create personalities and how those personalities come together and how that formed your own personality as a therapist. And it gets pretty intense, obviously. And it's a very important class. And so there's a lot of introspection, a lot of opportunity for it's a very person of the therapist class, whether it's framed that way or not. The second class and we don't have cohorts at Antioch.
We do now.
Oh, we do now. Like all students are cohorted?
So it's not through the program, but the POP model has taken, so the idea is like what you were talking about with FOO.
Yeah.
Is like students would have that introspective process, and then they're like, now what do I do with it?
Yeah.
In the second quarter.
Right.
And so the POP model is like, you're going to catch it on the other side. You might have even been pissed at a classmate because you disagreed about some topic and it brought up your, what we call signature theme.
Which almost always happens, by the way.
It's always going to happen.
Yeah.
But giving them opportunities to catch it on the other side and have them not just be like angry at the class or the professor, but also think about their clinical development. What's happening for you? That's the question we ask throughout the entire POP model for 9 months.
And just to, right. So just because I'm curious, is you haven't made the whole program a cohort. You just made the POT track.
Yeah, the first 3 classes.
Whereas other programs, you're on a cohort track the entire time, and you don't have really much choice in what classes you take.
That's what I had when I went to school.
Right. That's most programs. Yeah. And it makes the most kind of sense in terms of organizing things. But we've always had this credo or perspective or marketing push that you can go at your own pace because it appeals to people who are working and have kids, and so they can take 1 class a quarter or 4 classes a quarter. And so you can't have cohorts, and it makes it much more chaotic. And as a result, you end up being kind of shuffled into a class where you don't know a lot of people. Cohort, you benefit from getting to know your classmates, but cohort, you have a disadvantage that if you hate one of your classmates, you're stuck with them the entire time, which I guess it could be argued is a good thing, but I wouldn't. As a student myself, there were times when I would have a classmate that I was like not enthusiastic about seeing them again.
Right. Well, especially in that vulnerable process, in a class like FOO. But what I love about this model, there's things I do not like about any institution, including Antioch. But what I love about this model is that students they're kind of promising to be in that cohort with each other for 3 quarters. Yeah. So from an offshoot from there, if they want to take classes with each other, and especially this is really important during the pandemic, to build relationships across a couple classes at first. Yeah. Now they can, if they want to, like a lot of the POT students are in my current individual therapy in the family system class. And now other POT students who are in a different cohort, they'll find each other. Yeah. And they'll be like, oh, let's all take that class at the same time. So there's a cool convergence that's happening. Or you could be like, I'm good with that for a little while and kind of do your own thing and not be with the same students.
Right. So then the second class has always been a multicultural perspectives. Yeah. Or for a number of years was set up that way. And it was set up as a suggestion that you take it with the same group of people. And in this class, it's the primary class, and of course in every class we talk about cultural perspectives, sociocultural issues, power, politics. But in this class, that's the primary focus. And I don't know, describe to me the syllabus for that class. And I'm guessing it varies per professor, but in the POT program, what did that look like?
It does vary per professor. I will say, just as like a qualifier, I think a lot of times professors of color especially inherit a syllabus that's geared towards racism 101 for white students, because these institutions are usually white students. Right. And of course I'm not a white student, but like, I think that, so the syllabi have changed, at Antioch over the last couple of years, and that's been by some really intentional changes in the readings and the books, and what are we actually learning here was like the main question. Like, who is it for?
Yeah.
I used to have immigrant students, a collection of immigrant students say the same thing to me, which is, you know, and one by one, not all together. I don't think this class is for me.
Right.
And I'd look at the syllabus and I'd be like, no, I promise you, like, this article about white fragility and how you should tackle it in yourself is for you, non-white student immigrant. And like to a degree, because we're all affected by sociocultural issues in society.
I mean, it's good to know about, but yeah, it's and
they got to play witness to white students learning basic racism 101 stuff during the class and like tripping on themselves. And I'm like, everyone is here paying tuition to learn how to become a better therapist.
And there's this tendency or risk that the people of color, the students of color, will be tokenized and turned to as the 90% white student body looks to them and says, like, tell me how not to be a racist anymore. And,
right. Or tell me all about what the people in your culture think.
Right. And if you're a person of color, you're just like, why? Like, so not only is this class not helpful to me because I'm not, this material isn't for me, but also now I'm like an assistant professor and I'm paying for this. Right. And I'm uncomfortable and I don't feel like the students are necessarily listening to me. So how did you change it?
So the POP model was one of the main things. So one of the essential questions we asked throughout the entire track, starting with FU, is what is happening for me? So when students are having a conversation about something political that impacts the field, or, you know, about how we, let's say access barriers, right, to people who maybe historically distrust health services. Then when people are having a discussion, I encourage everyone who's in the listening, right, who's listening to other people speak, not to speak for other people's lived experiences, number one, but to encourage them to what's happening for you as you listen. So there's that constant introspection that's going on throughout the entire process. It can be a really knee-jerk reaction when you hear something distressing or a disagreement that you have with somebody else to say, I need to interrupt this and interject my view, or I need to stew privately until I, you know, combust about this difference in view. And that's our society these days, right? Mm-hmm. And so to give students a different experience of like, what if you could also just track what's happening for you when you're listening to other people's perspectives? Mm-hmm. And that has been gold for everybody, because students could be like, I can have my own development. I am given permission by the ground rules of this class to constantly track what's happening for me. Students used to be like, some white students used to be like, well, this other white student isn't getting it and it's holding me back in the class. And then I would have to say like, but what do you want out of the class for the last 5 weeks? Now that's built in from the start. And the way that we frame the class. Mm-hmm. We've also changed the textbooks. There used to be, I won't name them, but there used to be textbooks that would have been like...
Why wouldn't you name it? I mean, I know which one you're talking about. I mean, it's a well-known gripe that professor, isn't it? I mean, isn't it?
Yeah, there's two. There's Ethnic Families with Monica McGoldrick.
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes, like, she's great, but people are like, write a book about X, and she has limited capacities in some areas and expertise in other areas, but she's writing books about all the things.
Yeah, and it's not super cutting edge either.
And it's wrong. A lot of it's wrong.
Okay.
You know, like there's chapters.
Are you talking about the edited one, the ethnicity and family therapy book?
Yeah, conceptually, there's so many great things that are said, but then the examples fall short. And like students will be, I had a student from the Indian subcontinent who was like, we're talking about a particular country that he grew up in, and is like, this is wild. It's like it was some white person decided this was our experience, and but different authors are in there, but it's still speaking to like a monolithic experience. Like,
right, and it's an old model that's been widely debunked within our field. It was, shall we say, a good step forward 40 years ago, but it was very incomplete. This idea that, again, you're speaking to white people and you're saying, here is what people are like from Japan. They are collectivist and shame-based.
And probably won't express themselves in the session very often. Like,
Yeah, these over generalizations. Now, the chapters are written by, like, if it's a Japanese chapter, it's written by a Japanese American, but the model is limiting. And I don't think it's bad. Like, if you have it as a part of your overall curriculum and you also critique it and look at it through a critical eye, because there's no one monolith book that you could read and
Yeah.
walk away and go like, I know everything now. But the way it was taught often, the multicultural model, as that's often referred to, is if you just learn these 5 bullet points about this group of people, you're good. And and as long as you know those generalizations, then you have now earned competency with working with Japanese Americans, which of course is ridiculous, right?
Right.
So current models, correct me if I'm wrong, have much more to do with introspection, power, looking at systemic issues, systemic racism, systemic other kinds of oppression. And
to me, it's less about current versus old. It's about reclaiming certain ways of educating. A person who I have a lot of respect for is Carmen Knudsen-Martin, who did a lot of the feminist improvements on, differentiation. Not that differentiation didn't have that balance anyway, but all the examples were about like rationality.
Right.
It fell short in the example.
right, it was definitely oriented towards a male, white.
But the idea is you have
lack
to
of
have
emotion.
balance.
Yeah.
And so she was like, so she's always been interested in, that old saying, it's like teach a man to fish versus like give a man a fish.
Right.
And so the idea is if you have books that are about flexing your introspection and being admitting of what you don't know, seeking knowledge the best that you can, getting good supervision, taking care of yourself. It's a very different way of orienting yourself. It admits that it doesn't have all the answers from the go. Versus you have a book that's like, oh, these are the people from Pakistan. Here are the 5 things that you should know before this chapter ends. That caters to a very old, and I think Western sensibility that if you could be an anthropologist,
Right.
you go to a land or a people, and you can extract the 5 characteristics, which is dehumanizing, right? You're good to go. You're competent.
Yeah.
And which is bullshit. And it hurts all of our therapists because they're going to encounter people like from even their own social location. Like, people think that you're going to project more when you're working with somebody from a different background, right? But a lot of times people have assumptions based on their own experiences of their own social location, and they project that on their client, and there's more happening there. So what if we could orient everybody into like a more flexible, like, stuff's going to happen. You're going to be aware of prejudices you didn't know you had. By the way, this is not a dance between are you a good person or are you a bad person. You're not always going to get that ego boost after a first session, especially if somebody has trauma. You're not going to know how well you're doing as a therapist. What if we could spend this quarter sitting and stewing in that in an environment where you're supported, and have a book that's oriented that way? So we actually use a Carmen Knudsen-Martin book, Sociocultural Attunement. And it's more about being in process. So
The other book is the Sue and Sue book, right? That's the
the book that I was trying not to name, but the Sue and Sue book. So I have me personally, more resistance towards that book than the Ethnic Families in America book. But
yeah. So in this class, it's always been difficult. It's always been tough class, and I've never taught it. Primarily because I was program director for a while, and if we had to fire a professor halfway through a quarter, it was half the time this class, because we would hire an adjunct based on resume and hope that they'd be able to teach it, and something would go wrong and there'd be an uprising, and I'd hear about things from students and we'd have to fire them, or after the quarter would end, I would just stop giving that adjunct any kind of, or with that class. But it's a very fraught topic, obviously. How did you manage that?
it is very difficult. But this speaks, I think, to a larger issue, which is that a lot of times people who are underrepresented in their field are overqualified to teach certain classes.
Explain that.
So you'd walk in, this is not just an Antioch thing, I think it's just a graduate school thing. Sometimes you have, in my opinion, mediocre white people who are in their jobs who say, oh, I'd love to teach that like fantastical, and they have no expertise. Mm-hmm. You would never teach like legal litigation if you have no expertise in it. But you do have white people in this field because they look around, they don't see non-white people, and they're like, oh, I could do that exotic. I could teach multicultural perspectives. And then it becomes a calling card of them signaling to everyone else how they're, virtuous and woke. Look, I'm the white person willing to do it. But there's an extra labor that's put on people. Like Jen and I are minority fellows. So is Kayla. So is Anthony. So is,
In
you know,
AAMFT.
AAMFT.
Yeah, explain what a minority fellow is.
So you get extensive systems training, sociocultural training in research, qualitative, quantitative. You sit with a lot of like giants in the field, and you know, do think tanks, and you sit and stew in your own introspection, and you go to these think tanks, and it's part of your education away from your university's education.
You volunteer to have this additional activity and participate.
You have to actually apply for it, and so there's only a select number
But
of
you
people
don't get paid
that
for it is the point.
They give us stipends like for like research in school and things like that. Yeah.
Oh.
But it was
But, it's not, but not much, right?
no, it's not a salary. It's
Right.
not. It's like chump
I
change.
mean, I point
yeah.
that out because it's part of one's effort to grow as a human and as a professional, as a professor. It requires a lot of time and blood, sweat, and tears. You know, it's not, I'm guessing it's not easy in those contexts as well. There's probably a lot of emotional ups and downs and conflicts,
Yeah.
even among the minority fellows at the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy. Right?
Well, that's just right. It's like, you know, there's an extra expectation that's put on certain professors because it's not their first rodeo, and people can smell it. You know, you talked about like when people struggle with a type of class like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's probably not the best first class to throw at people.
Yeah.
But I think that when somebody does it well, you know, it's kind of like in Hollywood when you have an actor of color, right? They do a really good job in a movie. So then white Hollywood is like, oh, cast them in a million roles. We don't need to go and find talent in the community. Right. So that's the sort of like fundamental systemic problem that's there, is like, I have this double bind. Like the better that I do at this class, the less there needs to be another South Asian dude or a black dude for, you know, when Anthony does well in this class in these fields of like, you know, because we can, you know, and that's how you end up.
What are you saying? Like, you're saying that, tell me, I'm confused. What are you saying?
I guess what I'm saying is that when we show, and I'm speaking we to mean like people who are underrepresented in the field in some way culturally, right? When we show that we're willing to do more labor than we're paid for, especially a hard class like multicultural over and over again, it doesn't beg the field to go and find talent from different communities. We can just start to champion and tokenize that person.
Kind of slot the professor of color into these spots, and the other easier classes are taught by the white people. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you have to twist somebody's arm to find a black therapist they know besides Thomas Parham and Ken Hardy. Like, you know, and why is that? You know, I think it's because we have North Stars in the field, and a lot of them are not about sociocultural attunement and different ways that families show up and different constellations of family and collectivism and different ways to be in space with people. So when you have people that orient differently, it's refreshing for students. It's refreshing for programs, for people to think differently. But then really quickly, it's like, oh, that's really cool and exotic. And you don't have to go further. It doesn't get permission necessarily to then spread across the field. You spread it across the field, you get more talent, you get more people that are competent to teach a class like multicultural perspectives.
So with students, a good number of them entering the class have literally never had a conversation about culture, or at least an in-depth one. They are expected to have those conversations, to introspect, challenge themselves. How do you set up an environment? Because when there would be an uprising where we would have to fire a professor, often it was because the professor set up a very unsafe environment. The professor, unbeknown, you know, they didn't set out to do this, but they accidentally created a situation where the students came to class uptight and would default to saying nothing. And multicultural perspectives is probably the most discussion-oriented course, the most interactive course in terms of learning from each other and voicing your process.
Shared reflection.
Yeah. And when you shut that down through danger, then everything grinds to a halt. And how do you set that up? Yeah.
Well, number one, you have to distinguish between discomfort and danger. Sometimes it's hard to discern, but there are also easy ways to discern. Right? People who are, and I'm talking about white folks here, a lot of times who are not used to having daily experiences of discomfort systemically, when they have discomfort a little bit, they cry wolf. So when you normalize in the beginning of the class, you will be uncomfortable. it gives permission for students to be like, oh, this discomfort doesn't have to be danger. It could be something that we all are doing together. And the professor has to be willing to do that as well.
How do you do that?
I model, times when I screwed up. I talk about times when I screwed up.
What would be an example?
Yeah, so I'll talk about a time where I had expectations of, what I needed to talk about with the client from a different culture. So for example, I think it was like right after Ferguson, I had a Black family coming to visit me from 30 minutes away, right? Who didn't have like the easiest access to therapy. But because of the way that their insurance worked, they were able to kind of like see me, and because there was kind of a package deal with a psychiatrist they were seeing. And I like wanted to talk about Ferguson when that came. So I had projected onto them that therapy needed to be about my virtue signaling about the thing I'm telling them that I'm aware of is happening to their community.
How did you bring it up?
I was like, so I just want to check on you and all that. And I'm not like embarrassed about the check-in.
Yeah.
I'm checking, but there needs to be some review about how much I was centering it. They just wanted to talk about their kid who was struggling in school to sit still and had a bad rap sheet on him in school and needed some social communication skills.
Yeah, I find that to be the case with my clients as well, and most of my clients over the last number of years have been non-white, and I find that they want to feel safe if it arises, and they don't want to have a vibe of like, is he racist? So some level of discussion or disclosure for me to kind of set the stage, but the vast majority of the time they are struggling with the human aspects that they came to therapy for. And certainly some people come to therapy from oppression and racism and other kinds of isms, but
they deserve the full range of what can happen in therapy and dignity. So when they when they can smell that their therapist is turning them into some sort of caricature,
right?
I mean, that anxiety within the therapist of like, okay, on one end, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to make a mistake.
Right.
And on the other end, I need to say all the things so that I can like signal. That anxiety lives within the therapist.
Yeah.
And has nothing to do with...
But there's such a... And I guess the play, I don't know where you land with this saying, but for me, I just try to... I have a visualization of it. Like the awareness is it's like a light that's always on, I guess, in my soul. It doesn't demand that you look at it, Right. It's always on. So I spontaneously will come from a place of that awareness when it feels like it's suitable to the situation, I had a client, a black client, black couple, and we didn't talk about race for months probably, but when the husband had a lot of masculinity issues, and I was talking about that with him, and about suppression of emotion and the pressures that men are put under. I mentioned that I wanted to know from him, since I'm not black, if in the midst of that conversation, as he's really kind of breaking down, I asked him if it was particular to black men, and that really resonated with him, and that's all I said. We didn't have to have a long conversation. I didn't have to bring up Ferguson. I didn't have to virtue signal. I just brought up the question, because I think he was thinking it, but he didn't know if it was, because a lot of people of color worry they're gonna upset white people by just bringing it up.
Well, I mean, can you imagine like fighting through all the stigma in one's community, but also historically not trusting services for good damn reason, right? And then you fight through all of that. Maybe you got to drive a little bit, or whatever you need to do. You got to finagle your insurance, like whatever you need to do to get to therapy, right? And then the therapist is sitting there and it's all about them wanting to be a good person and less about your care.
Right.
And so we have to orient our classes in a way that goes beyond, am I a good person? And that's what I love about POT, because students can track, oh, that's part of my theme. I want to make sure if I do any harm, it really doesn't sit well with my internal framework. Like there's a lot of shame I carry with that.
Yeah.
So what if I, could be encouraged by my professors to draw a big circle around that shame and start to storytell with myself, well, what is it that I'm looking for? How can I use that in therapy in a way that's not this dance, that I'm doing in front of my clients and then I ask them to pay me. That's an ethical issue when we're just really worried about for good people, and at the end of the session, thanks, here's what the session costs. I think that we have to be really interested in, if I ask a question in therapy who's it for?
Right. And I think of it as a progression, and there's similar progressions that I've noticed, like an outside topic from what we're talking about that I notice is that people will progress through assertiveness. They'll start as a doormat. They'll go through a second phase of asserting no and mainly being selfish, but that's a good phase. And then they emerge on the other side. If they go through enough of that and they feel safe.
About students?
No, I'm talking about clients or just people. And then the third phase is to be able to say no, but also to take into account the other person. And when they enter this second phase, can be bothersome to one's life, not only the individual trying to develop assertiveness, but also to people around them because they're opposing often. And it's very different, particularly for their spouses, because they're not used to seeing their spouse oppose anything. And the risk is to recognize this phase is actually to some extent dysfunctional, because it kind of is. And so they'll go back to the more dysfunctional phase of being a doormat. And so similarly, I see students, not all of them, of course, but some will start from a place of relative ignorance and fear. And then they go into the second phase of like, okay, I'm going to address it now. And I'm going to talk about it. And I'm going to have courageous conversations. And that's a good phase, but it's not the end goal. What you don't want to just stay in that phase where you're constantly bringing it up all the time and inserting it all the time. You want to go to, I don't know, just off the top of my head, like a rough third phase is you can bring it up and you feel like you're able to, and you're not afraid of it, and you are aware of your own biases or the possibilities. The way that I always teach it is that when we talk about these subjects, it's about questions. It's not necessarily about answers. So you're always asking yourself, am I biased right now? Am I doing this right now? Am I inserting this right now? Did I just mess that up? Am I coming from my own cultural pocket right now? Am I not understanding something?
Commitment.
Yeah, you're never answering really those questions, but you're always asking, and you're allowing yourself to ask and also not know the answer. And so when you get to this third phase, you are spontaneous and attuned to the client, and you don't have a barrier to bringing up the topic of culture, and you will bring it up naturally, I guess, is what I'm saying, instead of inserting it,
Well, if you have professors, going back to what you were saying earlier, if you have professors that normalize discomfort as part of the process, that they're not going to be evaluated for being uncomfortable, they're not going to be evaluated for making a mistake. Now, if they double down, refuse to take feedback, are insulting their classmates, that's a different story.
Does that happen?
No, not when you set the norms in a certain way.
Really? You've never had a student?
I have, but it's so much easier to catch as separate from the rest of the discomfort when you set those norms. I think sometimes when people want to set ground rules in anything, a class, a show, a podcast, whatever it may be, they feel pressure to, like, we have to have the 100 perfect ground rules. No, you need 2 or 3 that the people who watch you see you committed to. Yeah. So if I say to my students, like, if it goes sideways, do I have your permission to shut it down? And I say that in the first class. I need to actually do that. A lot of times, and maybe this is a PNW thing, maybe it's like how we drive here, and I'm throwing some shade on my way out.
Pacific Northwest, yeah. Like, if
shit goes down and then the professor doesn't say anything, now the harm is traveling. And now the person who got harmed has to, do what they do outside in the world. Especially if it's a student of color, internalize it.
So paint a picture for the listener, like what does that look like when you might have to say something to a student?
Yeah, so like if you're in class and somebody says something like, my experience is that, South Asian people usually do this. And there's, it's somebody who's not South Asian saying this.
And they're trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
They're not trying to oppress. But
right. Well, we need to get away from this. Like, my intention was good, so the impact couldn't have been bad.
Right. But I just want to be clear that the student thinks they're actually being nice or culturally.
Or contributing or, sometimes devil's advocate.
Yeah.
About a topic, and we'll say something, and then it'll land on a student.
Yeah.
Where a student feels affronted about something, and then hijacks the rest of the class through their own musing. Right. They turn the professor or other students into villains, and they start to not even realize all the harms they cause and what they respond to. So, like, for example, if somebody experiences, that was like, if somebody responds to that, they hear another student say, well, we need to consider this, right? We need to consider how, immigrants came to this country in a different way or something like that. And somebody hears that and they start inside of themselves stewing, angry. We don't even know what they're angry about. And they cut off from the class. They start to, react in a way. I mean, I have seen this. And I think that's where, normalizing discomfort and letting people know that you're going through a process. You're going to hear things again that bother you. Your clients are going to say things that bother you, and your clients are going to say things that bother you. And it's not always going to be something where you need to like villainize and, take action.
So what do you do? Like, are you noticing the student start to stew, or the next time they say something, it indicates they've been stewing?
Yeah, I want to be clear. This does not happen often when you set really good norms in class. And if it does happen, the appropriate landing spots are like the next class or your journaling or your paper.
The risk I've seen happen is that the course will come grinding to a halt because everyone has to now stop and focus on this thing, and there will be hours spent like tending to this one event. And maybe sometimes that's a learning experience, but I, as a student myself, when I would see this happen, I would find that I think the professor gets so worried about making sure that everyone gets a chance to talk, or I don't know, some kind of passive approach where it just becomes this discussion quagmire. And
professors have their own signature themes too, right? And so
how do you deal with that? Because I'm getting the impression like you address it and you move forward, and that requires it's a kind of an art form, I think.
It is an art, and this is where I said earlier, like people who are. This is where when somebody says, "Oh, I'd like to teach multicultural too," sometimes I'm like, "Hell yeah!" Then I don't have to teach that class again. Less on me, to teach that class. It's the same pay.
Right.
But it's much more involved than another 3-credit class.
Yeah.
Right. But sometimes I look at it funny too, where I'm like, but you have no training in that. Like you would never ask somebody who's not an engineer to teach an engineering class.
Yeah. So
even if you're in the field and you took some, random diversity class back 10 years ago, you're not necessarily should be teaching this class because it involves what you're talking about, being able to orient the space in a certain way. So for example, if I tell my students, like if I say something that rubs you the wrong way, let me know about it if you feel comfortable, because we all have to be willing to admit that we are going to create harms even when we don't mean to. So this has to go beyond intention. And I say those things in class. And I will say it's a little bit easier as a dude to be able to say things assertively in class, and not be called a bitch for it.
Or bossy. So when someone confronts you and says, I didn't like what you said last week, how do you, in a hypothetical, what would be an average response to that?
Thanks for telling me that. It's really I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing that with me. I'm really...
What if you don't agree with it? What if you're like, I don't think you're understanding what I was saying, or I think you're overreacting?
That has happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, that has happened.
Because if you make a mistake, you just, oh my God, yeah, I can't believe it. But if you think they're distorted, or what do you do?
There's always a tell, and what I mean by that is that when students say, hey, I was offended because you, and then they start to attack, then there are tells or like little cues where I'm like, I can't hold that because I didn't make that decision for you to react in that way. And so being willing to own what part you can actually own.
Interesting. So because this is relevant, I think, to literally everyone listening right now, because it's everywhere in terms of the reactivity and this type, especially online. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think you're saying is that the student, one type of distortion or overreactive reaction is to generalize to you like you are a harmful person, or you
Right.
are a racist or a sexist, or because you said that, you are an unsafe person.
Right.
Instead of saying, I don't know what you are, but I didn't like what you said because of these reasons, instead of generalizing it to you as a human, as a representative thing of you and your because I find that online, especially, a lot of people, if they see a hint of something, there's a group of people that will think that is the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
That you're obviously hiding your sexist, racist, ableist, ageist nature, and you're lying all the time, but we just saw the real you when you said that one thing, and now I know you, the true you.
People are trying to organize the world into heroes and villains. They're trying to organize the world into people they put into pedestals or people they cancel. And I think that's a really toxic way to be. Now, there is definitely important ways, right, that we can use that when somebody's like gotten away with some really dangerous shit for 20 years, right? I went to Michigan State, where there was pervasive stuff happening with a gymnastics coach, right, for many years. And but I think like, and so institutions need to be counteracted in that way. With that being said, not everybody in front of you in a discussion is a caricature towards your signaling of like, whatever. Resistance, right? And this is where like centering people like Harry Aponte and centering like folks who have written about psychology, but they're not put into curriculums. Like there's all these volumes on Black psychology that people have written about, but they're never going to be treated as a nexus for how we should learn about our, but random white person that, talks about the same thing for 40 years and has a tenure track position. It's like, oh my God, like that's must be the heart of our field, and it's like, that's a cultural messaging. We deserve to learn from all sorts of people, wherever the science is, doesn't matter who it is, how we can relate to people in a richer way that navigates past impasse equating cancellation.
So do you talk directly about that, about cancellation versus pedestal in your
because like, okay, great, if you turn somebody into a villain, what are you going to do tomorrow with your client though when they say something that bothers you? Right. And it's not to skate away from if we create harms, but it's an and rather than an or. Hey, I hear you. Thank you for sharing that with me. I'm going to be mindful of how we speak about things in class. And, we got 5 weeks left in this class. I'm really curious to see where you're going to take moments like this, because you still got to be the professor. When the professor goes away from that and it's like, oh my God, my students don't like me anymore. And I had a colleague tell me, you can't give a shit about that when you teach multicultural. Because when you teach multicultural, you're going to have all sorts of projections. Sometimes people are like, oh my God, it's a brown man. And like, they connect with you and they just imagine themselves healing. And there's like this exotic thing that's happening. And I'm like, I'm a person. Like I don't sleep well. And my biodata is that I have ADHD and sleep disturbance problems. Like, what do you mean you're healing next to me? And like people will do that. And it's part of this like longer exoticizing that's happening. But I think, it's really, so sometimes it's not just like worried that they're not going to like me. Sometimes I'm worried they're going to turn me into some like mascot for their own signaling too, because I'm not a white person. And all those things are binaries. Like, are you a hero? Are you not? Are you my favorite professor? Are you the worst professor? And, do I like the students? Do I not? Is this class useful? Is it not? And we can do a paradigm shift. What do you need to get out of it? How can your professors help you juice what you need out of the class, especially multicultural, when everything that's happening, a discussion, a caucus, a fishbowl, a movie, a paper, or article, something's happening to you when you're going through it. Even if it's a numbing experience and you're distant from it, what's happening for you there that it might be less involved for you? To be curious, like you were saying, as an ongoing thing, it's a very different way of orienting students than, okay, let's put them into categories. Is this good or bad? Is this good or bad? And by the way, like when I think about, in general, not reactivity, but like actual calculated resistance justice, it's thoughtful. It involves the community. It takes a scan of resources. It involves distress tolerance. It involves leadership. It's not this thing that's like, oh my God, I'm so offended. And now like I need to hold everyone hostage for the next, 3 weeks. That has to do with like, I think a lot of that has to also do with privilege. You're a grad student or you're a professor, and enough of your life doesn't have to do with like daily injustices, right? And so when you have a little bit of whiff of an uncomfortable, you're like, it's unacceptable to me that I'm uncomfortable, that somebody had an opinion different than me, and I'm going to show everyone how unacceptable it is. And now everyone's hostage to you and your reaction. And I can take accountability as a professor for catalyzing a discomfort in somebody, but I will not take accountability for how another adult chooses to react. And I think a lot of people do a dance of like, I either wholesale blame myself or a wholesale blame the student or a wholesale blame. And that's a really toxic way to be.
Yeah. How do you not care if your students like you?
Oh, I do. I totally care.
But how do you distance yourself from that to teach multicultural? Because you said, didn't you just say that in order to teach that class, you have to...
I have good friends that remind me to think about the clients. You have to think about, what are we doing here? Sometimes
meaning that if you succumb to the fear of making sure all your students like you, there are clients that are going to be harmed by your lack of action with those students.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. We do fish bowls in multicultural. And what that is like we might have an article that's geared towards a specific community, and I'll make a rule that only certain students in the class can be in the center and have that discussion. And it's not that the other students aren't allowed to comment. It's that sometimes we need to practice listening skills. So I'll do almost like a caucus in front of everyone. So we had an article about Indigenous women experiencing the erasure of their communities, caricatures of men in their community. It's called Angry Women Are Building. I'm forgetting the author's name. I think it's Paula Gunn. But anyways, so only women of color or non-cis men are allowed to have a conversation in the middle of the class. And it's only for 20 minutes. But everyone on the outside, instead of reacting to the conversation, is asked, think about what's happening for you as you're listening, including all the things, the discomforts, the reactions, the disagreements, whatever, but what's happening for you, not what do you want to say to the student. I will sometimes worry, oh my God, are these students not going to like me because I didn't include them, right? But then I'm like, you know what though? This is going to be really a big deal when therapists need to have those moments of silence and they really say they're curious about another person's lived experience and they're in the session and they're listening. And I have good colleagues, Anthony, Kayla, Jen. You and I have talked about this a little bit when, you were around a little bit more. I need to care about the field. Sometimes I wonder if I was I don't know, a teacher in poli-sci or something, what impetus would I have to have the students sit in an uncomfortable moment like that?
To risk an uprising, to risk students hating you. So it's a part of the meaning of your life is to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's the ethic about the field. If we want quality relationships, we want quality. You as a student deserve a range of ways that you learn to respond to stuff.
Yeah.
You deserve it because you need those tools. And multicultural is one of those classes where instead of learning solution focus or IFS, and you're orienting towards a therapeutic alliance, you're orienting towards those things that underscore no matter what theory you're doing. So it's an opportunity. And I think professors who see it as an opportunity to encourage their students to think about the richness of the therapeutic alliance, including working past impasse, working past miscommunication. It's times when you mishear your client. This is an opportunity to practice with each other in class. And I say that in the first day. And then I ask the students, what will make this safe for you? And if they say something like, well, we want to be able to take breaks, okay. And we want to not speak for each other or large communities, okay. If I see that happening, do I have your permission to shut it down? And they're like, yeah, totally. First day, right? Because we're not in the dysregulation yet. Mm-hmm. So we talk about it up front. We make a plan. And I say, is it okay with you if I see you as adults trying to navigate it, but if it gets to a degree that I identify as too harmful, that I can step in? And they're like, yeah, totally. We need you to do that. Mm-hmm. But then the professor has to be willing to do that because harm doesn't just happen when the professor creates an offense. It also happens when they watch people get hurt and they wish it'll go away.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what I was referring to in a kind of earlier in my experience of being a student is you'll have professors who think they're doing a good job by creating a space for discussion, but they don't provide any leadership at all. And it goes off the rails. And as a student who's powerless in that situation, for me, when I'm in that situation, I just give up. My style is to just go on Facebook and and ignore it because I'm like, nothing is happening. And because as a professor myself, I would look to the professor and I'd be like, you should be doing something. You could absolutely be allowing a conversation, but you should be providing leadership. You don't even have to necessarily offer an opinion, but you can guide it. You can provide a frame for what's happening. And more importantly, maybe you can actually confront people and say like, well, hey, what's happening, what's going on for you right now? You're really talking about this other student, but what's happening for you? And because this is important for you to know as a clinician, because you're going to run into this with your clients. I've seen more and more of this lately. With students where that cancellation pedestal thing and also this sensitivity to topics even being brought up. Have you seen that?
I want to say by and large, I am mostly impressed by the students.
Yeah, certainly I'm usually am for sure, but
It's always an anomaly.
it's always an anomaly for sure. Yeah. And it, especially when speaking into this microphone right now, a lot of people have this idea that college campuses are just a bunch of snowflakes or something. And I've always been really impressed by students in Antioch at how chill they can be.
Well, they give a crap about why they're in the field.
Yeah.
They really care about this. We have like a really, high licensure rate. And I would like to be like, oh, it's because we're great professors. But it's also because they really care. They nerd out. And the distress tolerance is usually pretty high.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when there's one student who kind of like creates that binary of like heroes, villains, and it can happen at anything.
Yeah.
And you can't distinguish whether like the harm was a lot or a little. They hijack stuff for their classmates and hijack stuff for the professor.
Yeah.
But I'm much more committed to that type of accountability of like, I am the one who's teaching, so I need to be accountable to like, if a thing happens, that type of accountability I can get down for. I think it's really important that professors do.
Totally.
That's very different than I'm waiting to be the villain and I better like fawn or fight when somebody ascribes me the villain. That to me seems like such a low bar for accountability and something that wastes our time.
Yeah.
I'd much rather spend my time on accountability that's like, how do I hold this space when I make mistakes in holding the space? How do I readjust? And that turns into things like, let's change the books. Let's set ground rules. When the students tell us things in evals, how do we change our class going forward? It's a very rich type of accountability that includes, it doesn't go away from self-celebration, but you can do an and. You can be like, and I need to learn some stuff.
Right.
That's very different than, oh my God, I caused harm, I'm a terrible person, or I'm not, and the student is a terrible person. And oh my God, what an exhausting way to live that is,
Well, the thing that I'm thinking of, and it didn't happen very often, was that students would not, usually in my class, I can think of one student in my class, but it was usually advisees that I would have or something. And there would be this grumbling that they would do quietly or with behind closed doors with other students or something without voicing it, without going to the professor.
Isn't that the way you're supposed to do graduate school?
Yeah. And then certain things would get overblown. They would grow. I can't think of one in particular, but I remember often telling an advisee or a student that would just come to me, I would be like, you should have come to me like 4 months ago with this, because we could have nipped this in the bud right away. We could have gone right to the professor, or we could have gone right to the other student, or I could have helped you in this way, but you didn't. And now it's so out of control that I don't know what to do with this, because this has grown over time.
Yeah.
And, or in their mind, it has become so big and insurmountable that they can't return to equilibrium. And I didn't see that 10, 20 years ago.
Are you talking about passive aggressive dynamic? I mean, I will say,
I mean, that could be
like the hold and vomit later.
Because if you spend time in our society and on Twitter or something, there are the cancelable people and the pedestal people. And I think that mindset has affected some students where they will black and white a classmate or something, and it will become a really high focus for them. Instead of, I think in the past, students would have, not all the time, of course, but I think they would have more likely just been like, well, I don't know what's going on with that person. I'm here to learn, and I'll focus on things that are helping me.
I think what sets the norms for that, it's not student culture, though. I think it's academics. I totally think it's academics, in my opinion, because we do that. We talked earlier about like, you should have came earlier. But when you have a professor that's like not tending to the thing that happened in class and it gets mad about it, like, oh my God, I'm so mad that student did that to me 7 weeks ago and like said that in the class, because we're wishing it goes away. We're doing our own passive aggression.
Yeah.
Like I see that in academics all the time. I had colleagues, and this was like 10, 15 years ago, but I think our culture and society has changed. But I remember seeing like, students who needed to, had some like learning edges and things like that. And the professors wouldn't tell them.
Right.
But something would happen in the school, like maybe some like monetary shift, or, somebody's vying for tenure. And suddenly, as part of the person's like trying to get tenure, they're like hard lined about a student, and they collect all the emails from like, the last 10 months, and they're like, see, this is a student being combative. I'm like, that is toxic.
Yeah,
That's
no.
why people don't trust professors, because there are people in power. I mean, Antioch's a little bit different. We don't have tenure. We have a collaborative spirit. But as an institution, those power things that flow. And so a lot of times when I see, it's not to give students a free pass, but that responsibility of not setting things up in a binary is on everyone.
Yeah.
And it's hard to learn that from people you trust or leaders when they're doing that same crap.
Well, I hope that in my various rantings in meetings, put forth the opposite of that. I mean, I felt like it was weird. I might have told you this before, Zain, but for 20 years at Antioch, I was very young compared to all the professors. They were all baby boomers. I was the only Gen X, maybe a one or two other people occasionally, but I was always the new guy. I mean, I would be 15 years in to my career at Antioch, and someone would say to me like, "Oh, didn't you just get hired a couple years ago?" And I'm like, literally, it's been 15 years. And in academia, everything moves so slowly anyway. We'll have like an interim program director for like 5.5 years. Like, who does that, right? So anyway, and then all of a sudden, all the baby boomers retired, and we hired you guys, the 20-something, 30-something people. And suddenly I was the old guy and the seasoned guy and the guy who remembered the way things were before. And it was a very weird shift for me. And one of the things that I took on as part of that role was, I don't give a shit about what admin thinks of me, right. And I don't give a shit about what other programs think about me. You know what I mean? Like I'm secure, and no one's going to fire me. You know what I mean? And so I wanted to actually pass on an attitude of do what's right and don't be afraid, because I would see that a lot. And one of the things that I was trying to engender was, when you have a student that is a concern, like, have a proactive, rational, upfront, open response to them. Actually tell them directly, go right to them and say, remember that first day when I said that if this happens, I will flunk you from this class, you will not get credit? Well, you are doing that, and here's a chance for you to get out of it. And you have it all written out, and maybe you get other people to sign off on it, all these kinds of things. And
it's clear.
It's clear, and it's obvious. It's your job, for crying out loud. But so many times, I would say literally 99% of the time, I would see professors, even like seasoned professors, who would avoid it and be upset and literally cry in meetings about how this student was failing in this way, and they had all these concerns. And I would say, well, have you talked with them about it? And they'd be like, well, kind of. And I'm like, why don't we have a culture at Antioch where there's like this system where everyone does it, and you just have this automatic reaction? And I found that professors hoped that every quarter when it began, they hoped all their students would be brilliant and none of them would have a problem. And then inevitably there'd be one or two students that would be concerning, and they would be blindsided. And I'm like, it happens every quarter. There's always one student in every class, if not more. And so what's your routine, and you don't get emotional about it. I mean, maybe you have some emotions about it, but you don't get pent up over it. You just have a system that you enact that is rational. And if the student doesn't like it, I mean, whatever. But it's along those lines of like, you're addressing it up front. You're not being passive. And that could actually, spread to the students where they don't also quietly stew about something.
I actually kind of, what you described, I actually see it as healthy emotional expression too. Like, here's the thing that impacted the class, especially as therapists and training students.
I know.
Like, it's direct emotional expression, as much as it's rationalization. I think what Systems 101, right? Systems Thinking 101 is that if you do the same shit, or you run away from any changes, or you don't cause any interruptions, stuff is going to stay the same. You can't actually change anything that way. So, when people have training to stir shit up, they're not just stirring shit up for stirring shit up's sake. Sometimes they have ideas that are not accepted by the status quo, that are not centered, and you have to be willing to go through that process. And that means like, students who expect a professor or a classmate to fawn when they're too aggressive. No, that's not how things work here. Or professors who don't want to tend to something when something's happening, right? So many institutions in this country, like, we're like, oh, should we like make a statement? Should we not make a statement about George Floyd? And it was about the statement. It wasn't about how they held community. It wasn't about curriculum. It wasn't about recruitment.
Well, so I'll cut all this out if you want to, or if you don't want to answer. But I wanted to talk with you about the past couple years, pre and post George Floyd, and how active you were in the professor community. For me, I'll just briefly say that for the first 20 years at Antioch, I was active. I participated. I went to all the meetings. I tried. I leaned in. I took notes. I was on committees. I was program director, for crying out loud. You can't get more involved than that. But at the end of my program directorship, I was so burnt out that I just wanted to go back to teaching and practicing.
Yeah. And
all that stuff, that would happen in meetings was hard for me to cope with. And I mean, I'm exaggerating. It wasn't hard to cope with. It was just, I was burnt out. And so by the time you started coming around and coming to meetings, I was absent either literally or emotionally when meetings.
I noticed.
I know. And it was, I had no qualms because I'm like, you're not going to fire me. And if you do, then whatever. And and I'm generally a Japanese, Swedish, passive, reserved person anyway, when it comes to large groups. If it's a small group, I'm very active. But if it's a large group, I tend to approach it from a follower position. So when we were in meetings and the topic of racism or institutional systemic problems, you were one of the, if not the first person to speak up and speak often and eloquently. And being new to Antioch relative to a lot of, the professors, especially when we would talk about other programs, because, some of our meetings involve all the professors at our campus, right? And so there's dozens of them, right? And I'm just curious about if you want to talk about, because there are professors that listen to this, and of course students might be interested in this, and the lay people might be interested. Like, we went through Antioch a very common growth process or convulsion or something.
It wasn't unique to us, but we were part of it.
And it had all the themes, white fragility, tokenizing,
right.
All the stuff. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Okay. What happened?
Yeah. I'm going to be super blunt.
Please.
White people can be mediocre and keep their jobs. I don't have an expectation. I mean, I'm privileged in a lot of ways, right? My parents came here on educational visas, the whole myth of the model minority and all that. I have lots of privileges. With that being said, my socialization, anytime I take space, is that you better know what you're talking about. And you better be prepared, and you better pay attention, and you better have read all the emails, and you better overfunction.
Or else you'll be rejected or ignored.
You're rejected, or you're not the token anymore. You're not the person who needs to get a degree. You don't, all that. And although different, a lot of people who are underrepresented in our field and most fields carry that. I have to be a good representation. And not only that, I have to be excellent. And not only that, as somebody teaching about therapy, I need to be good to the students in such a way that inspires them, but also that will ultimately benefit their clients. So when you have professors, after a murder happens, and students are asking, this is an opportunity for us to think about how we hold class. And when a harm happens in class, what does the professor do? And professors go radio silent, or they become patronizing towards the students, like, remember, intersections matter, not just race. And like all this stuff starts to happen, which happened, by the way.
Meaning what? Like, shut up about
race.
Racism?
Yeah, don't talk about race.
Because I'm a I'm a woman, or I don't know, what would the
Well, no,
professor...
it's such a weaponizing of the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is so important, right? It is, right? We do not all have the same experiences. We all are empowered, disempowered based on different locations. Yeah. But sometimes people will wax poetic in this like academic, abstract way, like, oh, and weigh this, and so cited this, and whatever. And now we're talking so much that the thing that, like, somebody set a fire in a room, and this is not a real thing, I'm just using a metaphor, but somebody sets a fire and somebody's like, fires coexist next to religion and sexuality and all these other things. And now, like, everyone's like, what there's a fire.
Yeah.
So students talk about, I got harmed because of my race. And then you have a white professor waxing poetic, but God knows what. That's harmful too. I mean, they're doing it with the...
Because they don't know what they're doing, or they're anxious?
Both. I think it's both.
Are they anxious and they're trying to guide? Or what?
I think all the time. I think this is true about everything. I think it's true about professorship in any field. I think it's true about law enforcement. I think it's true about when you do not have a rigorous training, right? It's also about like giving people better training. But when you don't have a rigorous training about how to respond to a variety of situations, especially as therapists, when we're going to sitting with people, your location, who you are, your name, whether it sounds friendly, whether it doesn't sound exotic enough, or whatever it may be, like the things that like tell people like you should be here or not, right? Those things will allow you a certain range of like fuck up.
Yeah.
And not everyone has the same range of fuck up allowed.
So what did you see in the meetings at Antioch?
Oh man!
Because a lot of these meetings I didn't even go to because I was so...
I can't talk about a lot of the meetings. A lot of the meetings are private. I can't talk about the meetings. I'll talk in large phenomena. The CFT department was amazing.
Couple and family therapy.
Our program. But also, we at that time had more diversity than any of the other departments. CMHC also has more diversity now.
Meaning that more than half of our faculty were people of color.
Yeah,
right?
about half or more, right? Yeah. But it's not just, okay, plug them in. It's also, we were looking across the country for talents and expertise that we didn't have. And those are going to be people from different walks of life who have different lived experiences, who then have different expertise because of their different lived experiences.
Right. It wasn't, when we were hiring, it wasn't like we weren't quota.
Yeah, fine. It wasn't a quota, but you are inevitably going to find people from different walks of life when you're searching for different talents.
I mean, it was probably talked about, but the majority of the hiring decision was based on a good fit, merit, experience, trying to add other voices, but not necessarily, not tokenizing. But anyway,
I've been to, like, I'll give you an example. I've been to AMFT, the national conference, right? And I've seen the same white dude do the same presentation, change the words around, and like live a whole career off of that. Yeah. Who gets socialized to know that you could just do that for 20 years? Somebody else's secondary data analysis, basically somebody else's research that you publish on and get permission for it, right? That's fine. That's cool. But like those papers, who do they circulate with? You and your friends? And then you get to like keep your job and get tenure based on these like really like tiny little shifts. Not everyone is socialized to believe that they can do that. Other people have a socialization of, what have you done for me lately? And you better not make a mistake in your next class.
So you don't have to answer this question, but are you talking about other Antioch professors that are not in the CFT program right now? I mean, is that why you're
talking about professors in general? And I'll say that Antioch professors are not exempt.
Yeah. And so I'll say that it's possible that there are professors at Antioch who are resting on their laurels and their privilege and aren't pressing themselves to learn and think that they know everything, and they obviously do not, particularly when it comes to race. Is that what you're saying?
I do not want to focus on the Antioch professors. I'm not gonna. I know you're trying to get me to, but I'm not gonna make.
I'm not trying to dig up dirt. I'm just trying to provide a specific context that you and I experienced firsthand, and how this is a microcosm for a lot of institutions.
We're not exempt. Antioch has a social justice framework, written on its walls, right? And we talk about how like Coretta Scott King went here and all this stuff. Yeah. And there are a lot of advantages to having that framework. And I've seen the difference between that and the school that I went to, right? Michigan State was R1 research. It was like publish or perish. It was a very different culture, right? almost like a boys club of like who's who of the field, right? You had to be one of those people as a gold standard. Antioch, very much different, right? How are you going to contribute in the community, right? Really different orientation, which is good. We have a good licensure pass rate, for example. Clinics like our interns, like there's some really good stuff with that. With that being said, sometimes we won't look at things like, what is our tuition? What is happening in the classroom when we're talking about race? Who was appointed to teach that class? Was it picked thoughtfully, right? Or did we just pick any person and just like hope and pray, right? When we're having a large faculty discussion about something that happened to a student, that's something that's happening in the community, who's leading that discussion? Do we have an archaic, well, it's so-and-so's turn now? Or do we appoint the person who has some expertise in leading not just the content of that discussion, but like we were talking about earlier, the process of that discussion?
Right. And again, without getting specific, when an institution lacks leadership that knows what they're doing and sprinkle in privilege and being stuck in an old way of thinking, then the more aware people or people who are actually trying to further the conversation will start to criticize the leadership. And if you aren't open to feedback and you come and you don't even understand where the criticism is coming from, then we get a feedback loop systemically,
right,
that grows and causes the two groups to diverge further and further, and both groups dig in. But the difference is the people who are trying to progress the conversation have no power over, or have little power over how things go, because it's the leadership that can call meetings or cancel meetings or exclude people or make proclamations. And
I think there are people with degrees that can do much more than they actually do sometimes.
What do you mean?
People who have privilege and access and security in their jobs to a degree can do things on behalf of students and their colleagues that might ruffle some people's feathers, but it will ultimately be for a greater good. Like, we need to, this person ignored what's happening to the students. I'm going to say, hey, we need to not ignore that.
As a professor, when you have some power, you should stick up for the students.
Yeah, because it's a really odd paradox to be like, man, like I want to be champion for the power that I have on my CV, but I don't actually have that power when I need to stick up for the students. Like, what? Okay, I get it. Like it's easier for me to say this as a dude too, I will say, because there's some, we talk about the range of like fucking up or whatever. I have privileged in that too. Like, I can be assertive, I can be on this mic and say what I feel, and but then there's other people that are going to be either fired or pathologized, or it's going to be blamed on their gender or their race or whatever it may be for trying to stand up. You're just the aggressive so-and-so, right? Or you're the not warm, inflexible woman or something like that. And it happens to our peers sometimes, right? But I do think at some point, once you've climbed a couple mountains in your career and you're looking down, you're like, oh man, I went to school for so long, and the students have less power, and then the clients are trying to heal, and you're thinking about the ethics of it. What are we doing here? What's the point of this school, right? What are we training about? And you kind of do a little bit of a reality check. Oh, we're trying to create good clinicians, or we're trying to create students who will do good in the community. At some point, you can't just spend months and months. Oh, but I'm just gonna fawn to leadership and other professors and not say anything because I don't want anybody to not like me. I'm okay now with my colleagues not liking me if I'm doing something good. It's like if I pick up a piece of trash and I throw it in the garbage and it offends you, I don't give a shit anymore.
So did you have to go through that over the past couple years where you had
indirectly
to let go of
Yeah.
the hope that all of your colleagues, particularly in other programs, would like you?
But it goes back to the socialization piece and what I said about white mediocrity, is like a lot of us already have been socialized to know we're going to be isolated, or, spend time alone in our own thoughts, or have to seek out our own support. It's not an expectation that we're going to be okay all the time, so we have to be on it. So the switch to oh man, what if they don't like me? It's a little bit more seamless because, I spent my whole career knowing that I'm not centered in that way, right? That I'm not held in that way. that I need to be a token for my white professors back at Michigan State, or I need to be the perfect professor here. I don't screw up, right? And I have colleagues that have similar or deeper concerns, especially when you have a diverse faculty. But I think that sometimes the answer is people with power need to be better.
Yeah.
And when you have enough people that refuse to, and I'm not saying it's okay that students will do this, but you have enough people that refuse to be better. And sometimes it's simple shit, like a thing that happened in class, just name that it happened, like something like that.
Yeah.
Just say that it happened.
Or if you're having a meeting with professors, like, how about you just take some time to listen to what this faction is trying to tell you?
Right.
Like, I found it to be very odd how things went down. And I had more faith, I guess, in my colleagues. And I'm not saying that they're bad people or cancelable or something. I'm saying that during, in the months after George Floyd, it revealed a side of people I just didn't know existed. I didn't.
Yeah, me either.
I didn't know that these people had this in them. And I thought, wow, I would have put $1 million that you were not that person, but you are that person. And I guess now I know.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough when there's a moment of reckoning. Something's happening in society. I mean, we had a similar thing happen, not a similar thing in terms of degree of impact or the same. It's a different sociocultural matter, but with legislation being how it's now, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade and, the decision to leave it up to, states about one issue, but not another issue, all that's going on, people feel like they have to self-identify and choose a side or pick, and show who they are. And sometimes you see people you thought that would have certain convictions or care about how everyone's life is out here don't actually give a fuck and will play needless devil's advocate about things. I have a saying now, devil doesn't need an advocate that much. He's already wreaking havoc on everything. We don't live in a society that's peaceful and everyone's harmonious and people get along with their family during the holidays. We have cutoffs and traumas and things like that.
Yeah.
And so we need opportunities for repair, communication, and tolerance during disagreement. And you can't do that without what you said is moments of listening or moments of hearing or acknowledgement. Those things, even though they're simple, are really great landing spots for the continuation of dialogue.
Right.
Michael White in narrative therapy says, just keep the dialogue going, continue the conversation. There's richness in it. Because if we make it thin and we stop it and everything's done, now the last thing that we said in the conversation is the stamp of what the conversation was and what it isn't.
Well, and you just cause the faction that's aggrieved to coalesce into more anger and more righteousness, really. And the next time you have an opportunity to listen, you're going to have to listen to a lot more anger and criticism. So you're just kicking the can down the road. It's better to hear it the first time and say, okay, I don't know if I agree, but I hear you. And what do you want? Rather than just ignoring it. It doesn't go away. It just gets worse, I
will say that if it weren't for the CFT faculty and members of the education faculty and the CMHC faculty that, have diversity in those departments, but not just because of that diversity, but the willingness to have communication. I think that's a big deal. I can only speak to my own experience, but I was able to have a number of safe, healthy, ongoing, and that's the key part, ongoing communication with people that helped me stay at an institution and continue to be a professor and not check out. And I think that those things keep you honest with your students, they keep you honest with your own career path, and they keep you in community. But if I didn't do that, if I didn't have that, I would have been I don't trust any of y'all. And it's not about Antioch. It just, I wanted Antioch to be different than all the other places, and it's still an institution. It's not that different, and we have to reckon with the stuff that all the other schools do.
Well, literally, you and I would be in a meeting, and we would text each other about what was happening behind. I'd be like, "Can you believe this guy?" And he'd be like, "I don't know what's happening."
Well, you don't know all the other people I was texting. Yeah.
I'm not around much anymore, so have things just settled into mutual hatred or?
No, not at all. I love I'm really happy with the department.
But in terms of the vibe of like the campus, does it feel different now?
There are things that were true about things that need to be improved 5 years ago that are still problems.
Okay.
Professors need to be paid more.
Yeah.
We need to be recruiting from different communities, right? So the marketing and the recruitment of the school needs to be different, especially the way that we virtue signal, right? There are hesitations about things that deserve some actionables. Like people are like, should we do a land acknowledgement? Should we not do a land acknowledgement? Or you could be like, this is the land that's stolen, and we can have a program at school that pays money, towards indigenous folks. Like, put up or shut up. There are a lot of put up or shut up things about any institution.
At first, when I started seeing land acknowledged, if you don't know, there's a movement to, at various times, maybe at the beginning of a meeting, to acknowledge that we are on American Indian, Native American land, and that we stole this land, and we just have to acknowledge that. And at first I was like, oh, that's just so refreshing because it's such an ignored notion. And I think the more you do that, there's so many things that come from that, like white Americans will maybe stop saying, well, I'm a regular American, and they would point at me and say, like, where are you from? And I'd be like, where the fuck are you from, pal? You know what I mean? Like, I'll tell you where I'm from. I'm not from here, and neither the fuck are you, pal. So now, but then over time, I felt like it became this routine that institutions would enact, I think, as, in good faith, but it's like recycling. People will recycle and then they'll drive a gas guzzling car, and it's just like you're not being good to the environment. You're giving the land acknowledgement, okay, but what else are you doing? Are you doing actually anything else besides that? Yeah,
it's like McDonald's saying they have organic foods. Like, I'm sure the people buying it may benefit in
Meanwhile,
that one transaction.
The Brazilian rainforest is being cut down,
Exactly. So I think this is where distrust in institutions is really valid, and I'm like, my entire life I've been this person who's like this hybrid. I think it has a lot to do with who my dad was. It's like, I like want to like burn stuff that harms people, but I also know how to be I can do all the things in the institution, and but I think like that's where, when we were talking about mediocrity earlier, and Martin Luther King says this in a much more Martin Luther King Jr. says this in a much more refined and eloquent way than I will, but the idea is that if you can satisfy yourself with virtue signaling and saying, well, actions will happen at a more convenient time later, when everything's neatly lined up, then we never have to take any action. So a lot of times we're talking about, what are people's opinions, right? Are you conservative? Are you liberal? Are you progressive? Are you traditional or whatever? And if the actions are because I said this thing, or because my bumper sticker is this, or because I have a flag that signals this, if I can satisfy myself with those signals, I don't actually have to take real action. So an institution like Antioch, like UW, like it doesn't matter what, right, can say, we did a land acknowledgement, and can do it ad nauseum. We put it in all of our syllabi. Oh, cool, we handled it. Check. And that, it kind of reminds me of like, oh, they hired one brown guy. Check. You can satisfy yourself and keep the status quo moving along. Right. Malcolm X talked about the myth of firsts. It's like, if you could trick black people into being celebrating of, we have the first this, we have the first that, you don't have to worry about lifting up anybody else in the entire community, because you have the poster. If you got the poster, who cares about the rest of the work, right? So institutions, this is, in my opinion, all institutions do this. They have a status quo they want to maintain. They have a bottom line they're trying to achieve. I don't know how much they really care about people's lives being better. Now, incidentally, somebody in a role might be anxious, but I wish people's lives were better. I wish they got paid more. Right, fine. But when it comes to the put up or shut up moment, are we actually doing that at maybe a risk to maybe some of our wallets, or maybe we had to budget a little bit differently or hire a little bit differently, or leadership looked different where we didn't have as much of a say, but other people have greater expertise. So let's let them lead, right? And that would require discomfort and change. People don't want that, so they rest on their laurels and they rest on their virtue signaling. They rest on their posters. So the land acknowledgement thing, that's the issue, right? It's like, okay, but you're not going to find a lot of people who want to ruffle people's feathers and say, like, now let's do the next part, because now you're a threat. Now you're a threat. Now you're one of those people that's making all the white people and the tenure track people in other schools, not Antioch, but like all the people uncomfortable. Why are you making such a big fuss? We're making good intentions. Like, I don't give a shit about your intentions. I care about impact, because 3 years ago you said you wanted more diversity in the school. Most of my classes are still white. You said you wanted to have age diversity at our school. Most of my classes are still students right out of college. There are exceptions. So what is it really about? Like, because I could say anything. I could say I'm vegan and eat meat right now. You know, I could say that I care about other people's communities and then literally turn away when something happens to them. So for me, when you ask about my experience as a professor over the last couple of years and where it is now, I felt isolated with some company to like take that resistance and mean it, right? Like, hey, like, no, we should have done something different, right? Or we need to address that now. But now I feel like there's more, I would say, again, in my department, I feel a lot of support. I have other folks who are really just trying to change things for the better. You were really supportive too when we were doing the pot track, you know, because it was a different way of learning. And I was like, man, is Kirk gonna, like, you know, he's taught food for so long, is he's gonna, like, you know, be bothered by this? And I think, and I'm joking here because I like the dude, but I think you were probably like less bothered by it than like Paul would have been. but you know, you were supportive. You're like, if something doesn't work, you know, I remember you saying, if something doesn't work or we can improve upon something, why wouldn't we do it? Well, you need more people that are willing to be okay with things like that. But we keep our development down because people are just like, that's uncomfortable. Can't we just like say the thing instead of doing the thing? So that's my opinion on it. I just think that people rest on their laurels.
Yeah, and I think what some of the resistance was, people just don't agree that there's a problem in our society.
Well, that's because it serves them. The institution currently serves them.
Well, yeah, they've never actually had to question the status quo and privilege. And they know how to speak privilege, but they've never actually dealt with it. And so when it came, you know, like, say you proposed a measure that would spend money from Antioch to recruit students of color. And there are people who would, I think, they don't even believe that's important, because they probably still actually kind of associate people of color as less than. And they're like, well, they would never say this, and they might not even say
might
it
be subconscious
in their head, but they'd be like, but that's not a good thing. We don't want students. White people are better students. Like, I think I found that more people hold that than I thought did. I mean, I can't know their heart, but it just felt like there was something underlying, not all of them obviously, but some of them, it felt like, oh, you actually are legit racist.
Yeah. It's like, you know, I think it's like families. It's like, I can say, you know, that I care about my mom and my sister and my brother. But if there's a moment of reckoning that happens, like shit goes down in the house, now how we treat each other comes into question.
Yeah. Actually,
because we have to see, you know, what is it that I have the capability of doing or not doing?
Right.
And so when we kind of had the wool pulled over, you know, our eyes, and like it was revealed to us when George Floyd got murdered and the pandemic is happening. And by the way, there were so many murders that summer.
Yeah. Right.
Breonna Taylor. I mean, like, there's so many like that were going on. And when you saw people come to meetings, and this is not just an Antioch thing, like I've sat on some boards, and, you know, I do work out in the community. And so when you see other adults who like never had a thing to say before, saying things like, yeah, but don't you think that, you know, this is kind of like, you know, ruining our society? Or don't you think it's racist to focus on race? And like, they say these things, and I'm like, wait, weren't you the same person that was like critically minded about some like random ass nerdy subject? Like you can tell me about like this, that, and the other. But I mean, that's a little bit of like what our society is, right? Like I can go hang out with Mike and Mike can tell me what's in a car engine and you can talk about it all day and next week. But you ask him to talk about race and he's like, oh, come on, it's not a big, and he's critical thinking goes out the window. Like you have the ability, you're choosing not to engage that part of you on this topic. And so when I saw colleagues do that, I just like, you know what? And this is where I say that being in this field has so much utility. If I'm truly going to be a systems thinker, then I need to care about where systems concepts travel, not just in the family, not just in the school, but also socioculturally. It's really disingenuous to be like, I care about interrupting patterns that are harmful in the family. Oh, but somebody told me about harmful patterns out in society. Oh, yeah, but it's like this devil advocate thing that people do comes from a place of privilege in that moment. You're not just offering a different perspective, you're shutting down resistance. There's a difference in the momentum. If you're actually listening and then you're offering a different opinion, that's different. But if you're like, yeah, but, and somebody hasn't even finished talking, that's why people who are underrepresented feel so much exhaustion, because you have to repeat yourself for the most basic stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I frame it is, and I flip-flop on the optimism issue, but on the optimism side, we are learning, we're growing as a society, we're changing. We have a long way to go, but there's a power that we have as people who talk about these kinds of things. And I think that in the past, it would have been shut down so fast. We also would have had a harder time coalescing. We might also have a lot of internalized oppression that will shut us down before we talk. Now, I think things are getting to a point where we're gaining ground. And I think to the oppressors, they are having to actually verbally respond, or they actually have to do something against, because in the past they could just sit back and let
watch the design play out.
Right. And now they're actually revealing themselves. They're actually like saying, they're putting their money on the line and saying, this is what I believe and I don't agree with you. And it's disheartening on one level, but I think it actually is a sign of something good, because it indicates that they're forced to reveal themselves. In the past, they didn't even have to say anything.
I had a colleague in this field who was very well spoken and very had a rigor, to their work, and it was revealed to me that they struggled when somebody who was like not white took leadership, especially about expertise they didn't have, right? And I don't know their intentions, I don't know their heart, but I saw it play out. And there's that kind of like implicit like, oh no, but you're dumber than me though. Like I need you to be dumber than me because I need to take the lead. You're not the right person to take the lead, right? And so I saw that play out, but I think like there is celebration to be had about these moments as well. Like as much as I'm like, oh, and you asked me the question, like, how do you feel about your colleagues? Did something go down at Antioch and, all this stuff? I will say like, since we've had these conversations, Antioch has had caucuses at the satellite campuses as a faculty and in the departments, depending on the departments want it. The student groups during the pandemic, specifically counselors of color, the BSU,
Black Student Union.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of other groups. Like there's a group called Messy Conversations. There's a women's group that meets to have events and conversations. Narratives of Pain, which is a storytelling showcase that I do. These have been more active, not less. Even though we've been on Zoom, and even though there's been a resistance to change.
Yeah, I would say that as an example, the Black Student Union has, it wasn't called this always, but there's frequently been a group of Black students that will provide statements or feedback to us. So it happened after George Floyd. They provided a list of things that they wanted to be changed.
Right.
And for the very first time, I'll tell you, that our program really spent the time and had really long discussions as professors. And I was actually on the committee to write up a response addressing everything that we were going to do. And it took a lot of time and a lot of expertise, really. It wasn't just, the committee wasn't just thrown together, it was people that knew how to think about these things and how to collaborate on a response. And I was just a small part of it. Everyone, you were a part of it. And it was a back and forth, and it didn't always go well. There was
no, definitely not.
There was some bumps in the road. From my memory, the students were like, "You're not listening to us, or you're not really addressing it." But we kept at it, right, in a way that I'd never seen Antioch do before. I'd never seen that level of commitment. It was because it's commitment of time, right, and that's money. Because when you pay professors to sit in meetings, you're spending money as an institution. I'd never seen that much. Because in the past, it would be like your token person of color professor would just kind of have a conversation with them and say, okay, we'll try to do that. And nothing would really change, or maybe a little bit. But this was I don't know the full picture because I was only a small part of it. But from your perspective, did it go well?
I think overall, there's been a deepening of relationships at Antioch because even though these larger systemic things are still true about recruitment and tuition and all these things, I think that, especially like our department, we've allowed there to be leadership. Like we have so much talent, and all of us have different talents. Like Dr. Anthony Pennant, like he has, talents in neurodiversity and structural therapy, and, he leans into those. And, I care about narrative, and I care about person of the therapist, and, I lean into those and Anthony does too. And, and then we all have our talents, and that also what's going on there is less resistance towards people really taking leadership roles. And we have so many of us that do that now, that it allows the students to truly see us and communicate with us. So it's not just that one-off, like, okay, you go handle that thing so the department doesn't have to. It's more of ongoing conversations that are happening. There's still like larger level changes that need to be made. But I do think that the changes, the challenges to the status quo, the not being satisfied with ignoring a conversation, the resistance that happened, there are a lot of positives that came out of that.
Yeah. I'm curious about the relationship between the professors and the program, our program, and our students of color. There's still issues, I'm guessing, but is it better than it was 2 years ago?
I can only give my opinion, and I believe it is better. Okay. I believe it is better because I'll draw on a conversation you and I had a couple years ago. We were talking about interviews, like students getting into the program. And I remember, as a new faculty, not wanting to just like say, okay, cancel this student, they're not ready for grad school. But I remember you had, I don't know if you remember saying this, but kind of rebutted that and said, if you don't want them in your class because they may, harm other students, or they might not be good for the field, they're not ready for grad school, why would I want them in my class? Do you remember saying that to me?
I remember saying that to a lot of you new people. Yeah. Because I found this guilt of denying a student entry into the program. And we, at the time, and I'm guessing still do, have too many applicants. So if we're going to whittle it down the list, then if a student rubs you wrong, which should say something, then do not let them into the program. Because if they are in my class, I'm going to blame you for letting them into the program.
Every human being has a growing edge, and sometimes we abstract growing edge to mean anybody can get in.
Yeah.
And like you would never do that in law school. You could never be like, oh, this person has no basic understanding of how the legal system works. Let's sign them up for like legal graduate school. But sometimes,
and to be clear, often the kinds of issues that we'd run into as interviewers were personality problems that are probably not likely to pan out very well. Someone who wouldn't listen well, they were narcissistic, or they would put other people down.
During the interview.
During an interview where you're being scrutinized.
But that's part of the mediocre thing that I was saying. Is like I don't think it's just white students, but if you go to an interview and you expect to get in somewhere, even if you were insulting everyone the entire time, that has to do with privilege. You can spread your arms and hit everyone, and people are still going to give you your flowers. That is not everyone's expectation. So when you hire the standards of what it is to get in, and that, to go back to your earlier question, like, is it better now? I believe we've hired our standards. Okay. And I think we've also increased our standards about what it means to be a faculty at Antioch too. When somebody refuses to have a conversation or take accountability for harm that they've caused, like if I insult Jen or something, who's a dear friend to me, it's an important thing that we talk and we work through it, because there's a larger relationship to be had. When people avoid that, they double down, they unilaterally continue to harm, it gets sifted out easier than it used to.
Have you had those conversations with other colleagues?
We've talked about this, like, I think conceptually, like, what does it mean to be faculty with each other? We have to be able to directly communicate. It doesn't mean you reveal all the things maybe you would tell, God or your therapist. But, there are things that, if I have a thing stewing between me and another person, and it could be nipped in the bud, or we could communicate about it directly, or it's a misunderstanding, why wouldn't I just reach out to them, even if it's uncomfortable?
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, we don't reach out. We triangulate, we talk to somebody else, we gossip, and we go to family therapy like, hey, let's interrupt this triangulation for this family we're working with, and we're not willing to do it in our own lives.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, that was another sea change in my time at Antioch. In the beginning, it was literally three of us. It was me, Paul, and Jerry.
Oh, okay.
And Paul, the way he led and the way he is, he just has a way of pulling you into very personal conversations, and Jerry too. And so for me, even though I'm fairly reserved, with them, we would talk and process and cry together and bond together. But it was just the three of us, Now there's 20 something full-time professors at Antioch, and a lot of them are new to the city, and it's a different vibe, and yeah. I'm glad that you as a group are trying to create those connections, because it has a lot of benefits, not just what we're talking about, but just feeling good about going to work. And
we deserve professional community, but
also just back before it was now, it might be hard to imagine this, but it felt way more like a family. It felt in some very dysfunctional ways.
Yeah.
But it had a warmth to it, it was smaller, so that helped. But it'd be nice if you could get away from the dysfunction of the past but hold on to the warmth and the togetherness,
yeah.
This part of the reason why I invited you over here today was because I did have that to some extent with you, and because you would initiate things with me, and I miss that as I'm not around much anymore.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think it's so valuable. I think when the structure does not give you intimacy because there's 14 professors instead of 3, you have to be able to create that in some way.
Yeah.
So if people want to keep to themselves, or they're introverted, that's one thing. If people want to ignore harms and not have important conversations, that's another thing, right? And so when you have a group of people and you want to create that intimacy, and it's a larger group, the only way you can do it is by creating cultural norms. Right. You have to have opportunities for discussion. You have to be honest when things are going on. You have to, you can't skirt on your responsibilities all the time and expect another faculty to do it on your behalf, like things like that.
But also being online, I think, because the way that, and maybe this is just me being an old guy, but when we were before, particularly in the old building, because we all had our own office, and again, there were far fewer professors, you would just sort of bump into each other, and you would sit down in someone's office and you just talk for 4 hours, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And today, especially when it's so often online, like are meetings in person yet?
No.
Yeah, they're still online, right? So I think you lose an opportunity there, I would have really long conversations with Paul or Jerry or Michelle Honey, and Michelle Finley for that matter, and others. And I didn't know about other institutions, but I knew in relation to the University of Washington that we had something that was different, it was human. And I worry that our program will lose that. And I like that we've become more systematic, more, the rules are written down and we have procedures. And because I always hated the fact that everything was in Paul's head. Nothing was written down. I'd just be like, so what do we do in this situation? He'd be like, well, we do this. And I'd be like, where's that written down? He's like, oh, well, I just know that. I'm like, I'm going to forget that when it comes up again. Can you write it down? He's like, nah, just ask me. I'm like, it's so stupid. It's a dumb way of running an organization, And so I like that it's more professional, but I worry that it's losing some humanity.
Well, I wonder why there's a setup that those two things have to be at odds.
No, I don't think they do. That's what I'm saying.
It requires professionals to be in intimate, healthy communication with each other.
Yeah.
And I think I'm using that word wisely, widely intimate. I mean, to mean
a cultural
close,
thing.
Yeah.
I think because in the past, like Paul and even more so Jerry, they were so personable. They would force you to be personable.
Mm-hmm.
They would make you have vulnerable conversations whether you wanted to or not, to some extent, and so there isn't really anyone like that. I don't think. I don't know, you have new professors right now, but
I believe I have it because when I came here we were suddenly more diverse, and it was really important for me to have a type of community with the people that I was working with. And then we talked about like larger institution, but then department, and then within the department it's like, who are your people? And when there's like a large group of people, that scan becomes a little bit harder, right? It's not just given to you like 2 or 3, right? So it has been really cool to discover who my people are within the department, and I know who they are. And we're on text threads together and we talk about stuff. We send each other like random gifts and stuff, and it's great because it gives levity to it, but you do have to fish it out. You do have to fish it out, and not everyone's able to achieve that or fish in a way that's gonna, get them that outcome. But that's actually, if it weren't for that, like I was talking about this earlier, if it weren't for that at Antioch, and I have like a pot of people in another department too, a couple of other departments that I hang out with, but if it weren't for like the 2 or 3 people, and I do everything with them, I publish with them, I travel with them, I write with them, and that intimacy is there. Now the landing spots for it, do we hang out in person all the time? Are we in classes together live all the time? Are we in meetings together? No. So the depth of it has been interrupted, but I will say that like that was a really important value for me, just to find professional community when I got to Antioch, and I do believe I was able to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, of anyone, I would say you were definitely probably the most active and the most warm and sort of authentic, I guess, inviting around that. So that was good. But we've been talking for 2.5 hours, and I feel like we should probably just end it.
Yeah, we could do that.
So thanks for joining me, Zain.
Yeah.
It's been self-indulgent at the very least. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself. Why should they take care of themselves, Zain?
Well, because if you don't take care of yourself, then you're not going to be able to enjoy your life as much, and you won't get enough rest to enjoy your life next week. So remember to drink water and sleep, and be in good company with other people.